Remember, there was a world where people still believe that kids should be out kicking footballs or playing cricket. Our argument back is that you can create a safe environment for kids to be gaming as long as you put the guardrails in place. The esports industry had a bit of a cold time, and there was a couple of brands that had gone public. There was a downturn in the esports market. I actually think that's now coming back up again. So the Superbowl is a brilliant example of everything that I think that esports should probably aspire to, because you get an environment where you've got this incredible marketing opportunity, incredible media rights opportunity. The whole thing is like the pinnacle of the pinnacle. Come and watch what happens on the server, and also come to a venue and feel that raw passion. I think that you cannot replicate that passion in any other walk of life. We just don't see it. It's sports and esports.
Robbie, pleasure to have you, and thank you so much for joining us today on The Business of Sport.
Lovely to be here. What a great place to be, and what a lovely conversation to have around this specific topic.
Well, yeah, we've known each other for a while, and it's such an interesting space, and as mentioned, one of the most requested by our audiences to get an insight into. So before we go deep into anything, I'd love to get your perspective on what the esports industry actually is.
Look, a phenomenal industry that if you haven't engaged with it, your kids probably are engaging with it. As a wider community, it's creating an enormous amount of fandom. You know, you're hundreds of millions of consumers around the world watching competitive gaming, either on their screen or in stadiums around the world. And so, to be very simple about it, this is the notion of video games being played competitively within an environment. So think Man United, Man City, Team Liquid versus FaZe Clan. These are the clubs that represent their specific games. And millions of eyeballs watching those players who are anywhere between the age of, say, 16 and 30 playing on a professional basis.
So I noticed there you actually mentioned competitive gaming twice, less so on esports. There's been a lot of conversation around the terminology. What do you think is the difference? Is there a difference between how we phrase esports and referencing it as competitive gaming?
Yeah, I suppose the reason why I do that is because we're far more focused on the competitive gaming side rather than the sort of mainstream esports angle. So you've got millions of people and consumers playing esports on a daily basis, i.e. connecting with one another on a server, playing esports with each other, right? I suppose you could argue that that is also competitive gaming. I mean, ultimately, if you and I connected to try and play each other in a specific game, we're competitively playing against each other. I don't think you're an esports fan. I think you're a fan of a particular game, and there is a derivation of that game, which is esports, right? So I think first and foremost, you absolutely love Fortnite, or you love Counter-Strike, or you love Rocket League, and then it just happens to be that there is a competitive esport that drives from there. And so if you ask a consumer, if you ask my 11-year-old son if he was an esports fan, he'd say, I'm a Fortnite fan. So I think it starts with the game first. And I think the notion of esports is the environment around how you play competitive gaming, right? Either you're playing that in your room on a server against 100 kids in an environment worldwide, or you're in a stadium and you've got cameras on you and you've got millions of eyeballs watching because you are the best out there. That for me is the difference.
You're CEO of a company called Blast. You talked about events and production there. Give us a little insight into what Blast actually is.
We're a global esports business, a global entertainment business. We put on these absolutely phenomenal shows all around the world, whether they're in a stadium, we've just been in Sao Paulo, right? In this really old stadium, which we converted, we had to install our own air conditioning into the stadium. And you have 10,000 Brazilians daily going in there, going wild. And then you've got millions of people watching your stream online. So it's a bit like, you know, we're doing the entertainment angle for a football match, but then we're also responsible for making sure that millions of people are watching that stream around the world. So part of our responsibility is putting on the event, the show, but also the whole technology that sits behind broadcasting it, producing it, managing the integrity of it, the officialization of it, et cetera, globally. And we've been at that for about 5 or 6 years.
What's the fandom like in this space?
It's like something you've never seen before. I think that, you know, we were just talking about the IPL before we came in, and I think that if you take a hybrid of the passion in India for cricket and the passion for a given game from a consumer that is basically grown up with just that, and you put them in an environment where their heroes are playing and they can really associate with it, I think you then get what a feeling is like. And I walk into a stadium and I see people just going crazy, crying, shouting, shrieking. We had a proposal last week in the stadium. You have,
on screen?
On screen. In Brazil, this gentleman wanted to propose to his future wife in the stadium in front of 10,000 people, and the Brazilians just went wild for it. You have this ambiance where you can feel the energy from the sound, from the light, from just everything that surrounds you. And I don't think I've experienced that in an indoor setting before. You know, I put it to an akin to when I turn up at a football match, and maybe I support the wrong team in London. I just remember turning up at White Hart Lane and walking up the stairs and seeing the grass, and that being something that I remember as a kid. When I walk into a stadium and we've built out that venue and the staging and the lights and it's just big LED, you're like, wow, this is amazing. And I think that has an enormous impact on spectators. And then you get this FOMO, right, where if you're not watching, you're not in the stadium, because we do a whole bunch of work on sort of camera shots and looking at the crowd, and everyone's got something in their hands and holding up and cheering, or jerseys, etc. So the fandom is wild. And if you're online and you're not there, you just want to be there. So yeah, phenomenal.
We've seen such a development or a sophistication of the industry, should we say, over the last 10 to 15 years maybe. And a huge part of that has been bringing people into the top of organisations. How did you come into the space? Because your background wasn't gaming or esports, was it?
No, I came in, I'm media and entertainment really through and through. So ex-Google, was working on their mobile stuff there, and then I was at Disney actually prior to this. The two companies I was working for were bought by Google and Disney. So I suppose I came in through the back door almost in both of those organizations. But this presented, in both times actually, I saw an opportunity, i.e. I saw mobile and I was like, this is definitely the future. People are moving in that direction. We're talking, I'm showing my age here, but we're talking a while ago. And then in Disney, we were an influencer network that was bought by Disney called Maker Studio. So working with all the big YouTube stars before they were really massive, I suppose. And I saw that as an opportunity. For me, esports was about the business angle. I saw that fandom and I was like, wow, these kids are going wild in stadiums and there are millions of eyeballs of people watching, and you can't target this consumer at the moment. They're the most desired targetable audience. There's definitely business that sits underneath this. And I was like, that's something for me. I really want to engage with that. And so I fundamentally believed when I came in, which was about 5 years ago, and still do today, that there's a massive amount of opportunity within the space from a monetization standpoint.
How much of that has been accessed at the moment, and how much is still to be discovered?
I'd say we are a very small part of the way there. And that has been honestly slower than perhaps the market thought at first and the investors thought at first. I think they thought that esports would monetize much faster than it currently does. And the reason for that is there's a multitude of different reasons, but I think that we are probably 5% of the way there. There's a long way for us to go. Why? I think mainstream brands have not yet come into the space in the same way we thought they would, as fast as they would. And some of the reasons for that is that some of these brands are anxious about being associated with titles that are first-person shooters. Quite a lot of the games that have the large following are games where you are firing a gun in some capacity.
So this is like Counter-Strike, Call of Duty,
correct,
Dota,
Rainbow Six, or they're very tactical games which mainstream advertisers might feel are confusing or difficult to understand, which is not the case, by the way. And so I suppose they are struggling currently with being associated with that level of content. But here's the thing, kids who are playing esports and competitive gaming, they want to play those games rather than games which are, real cricket, or I'm not saying there's anything wrong with real cricket or, NBA 2K or whatever. There's a market for that. But the viewership for those audiences and for those games are markedly less than Counter-Strike or Dota or League of Legends, for example. And I think that is something that advertisers need to get on board with.
How do you do that? How do you speak to advertisers and brands and commercial partners to give them that security? Because as you've highlighted, the Olympics, Football World Cup, those are the safe spaces for them to operate in. But as we know, there are issues around the demographics that those organisations, those tournaments attract.
Correct.
If they speak to younger people, if they want to, they have to start taking this seriously. So removing that fear is a key part of it. How do you go about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a fundamental task of making sure that the data, that the information that underpins everything that we do from an advertiser engagement perspective is on a par with some of our counterparts in football and tennis, cricket, Olympics, right? Because at the moment, the cohort of data that's being used by some of the people who are selling commercial rights in esports is less mature, right? And that is really important. I think the other thing we have to do is create content which is obviously authentic and resonates with the consumer. I think we do that quite well. And I think that when brands are spending money and they're dropping investment in esports, I think they're getting an incredible return. We have to be able to show that better. And the reason why I think that data's not there, just to be clear, is quite an important part of the value chain. If you understand how esports operates, the publishers have an enormous amount of control over the value chain because it's their property, it's their intellectual property. Therefore, they sit on a lot of the data points that are crucial for people who are monetizing that IP and working with that IP. And we have to try and find a way to try and extract some of that data and provide it back to the advertisers.
So at the moment, for you, do you have an example of a brand that actually has transitioned very well with you at Blast that maybe you wouldn't have anticipated would have been a good fit 5 or 6 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, we've done some very interesting work with the movie studios over the period of time. Most of the movie studios releasing films during a period of time. That's been a good transition for us. The automotive sector has also worked very well. The Formula One team Alpine sponsored our major in May of last year, and we had the car in the bowl. Sorry, the Formula One car in the bowl. We had a skinned up version of an Alpine car outside by a skin artist from Counter-Strike that was very strong. We then actually also appeared on the car in the Monaco Grand Prix, which was great because Ocon was third, right? I think then we've had some very interesting developments with brands.
Sorry, that's like a crossover. So it's the collaboration between traditional sports asset and esports
Correct.
brand company.
Yeah. I mean, you can understand why. Alpine as a brand, they're having a pretty poor season this season, but they are an emerging brand aspiring to attract the same level of consumer relationship that Ferrari has. Ferrari definitely makes way more money from their branded materials than they do from Formula One, I'm assuming, right? And Alpine wants that younger audience to associate with wearing Alpine, with being part of Alpine and aspiring to buy probably a Renault eventually. But ultimately, that is the reason why that crossover works. And when they think about Formula One audiences skewing in that direction, it's done a good job. Drive to Survive has skewed that audience down because it wasn't there before.
Yeah.
We were talking probably 40 plus a few years ago, and now, I'm sure you've got 16 to 25-year-olds in Drove. So I think that has made a big difference. So they saw the impact. They saw that the numbers were going to be huge, the viewership was going to be huge, the audience resonated in terms of the demo, and so that translates well. In other sectors, we've done a lot of work with people like Unilever on Magnum ice cream, for example. I mean, that sort of makes sense, but I like that because if you get your P&Gs and your Unilevers of this world coming into the space, then I think you're on track. I still think it will happen. I still think that brands will spend massively in esports. I think that will happen in the next few years. And I think the reason for that is because if you think about the audience that is associated with watching esports, it is colossal. And I think that brands will realize that's the only place they can reach them.
We're used to seeing 7-figure deals in traditional sport. Are we there with esports, gaming environments? Are brands committing that to traditional sponsorships?
I think that brands that are endemic to esports, yes. Those who are involved in selling directly to those consumers are prepared to spend a lot more money to attract them. I think we will get there with the non-endemic brands, and those are the ones we want to target. I think we're more at 6 figures now than 7, but I think it will change. We have an event in London in June, and we're already seeing an enormous amount of uptick from some of the sponsors wanting to engage that event at Wembley. You're seeing traditional brands will be spending against that, and I think that will continue to move in that direction.
Tell us a little bit about fandom within this space. We've touched on why someone may follow a title and then the wider industry, but we're not talking about localized fan bases necessarily in the same way we do with other sports. Geographical relevance may be less important. Age demographics touch on really valuable commercialized, desirably commercial demographics. How do the fans interact, engage, build their kind of community within esports that as a point of reference may differentiate from a traditional sporting entity?
I think that if you take a step back and if you take the world at large and you look at the coverage of different games, different pockets of the world have a propensity to like or be fans of certain games. So for example, we were talking about Rainbow Six, which is a Ubisoft title. For whatever reason, in Brazil, they absolutely love this game. So there's an enormous community around Rainbow Six. They're incredibly engaged. There are an enormous amount of Twitch channels. There are destinations they're going to get their news, and they're turning up en masse for an event. If you take the sort of CIS region, right? You know, Eastern Europe, whereas Russia, etc. You know, Counter-Strike and Dota, massive. China, Dota, massive. League of Legends, huge, right? So you've got these pockets of geographies or games which do very well in certain geographies. And then you've got communities that are building in and around that. And I think the publishers understand that. And so therefore their direction to us is, we need to go where our fans are, because clearly they're looking at what their in-game revenue is looking like, and they're looking at their ARPUs from specific geographies. And so, you know, Ubisoft knows that Brazil does well for them on a transaction basis. Maybe a Brazilian spends a third as much as someone in Japan, because Japan's also big for that game, but it's still on a volume basis very important. And
fan spend. Premier League versus, let's say, an NFL, $1.50 or something for Premier League compared to 50 for an NFL. What's it like in esports?
The publishers look at the work that we do as an operator within esports as a marketing tool, right? So we are the face of their game from an esport perspective. We are their access to those consumers to make sure, in the same way that you and I buy a ticket for Taylor Swift or the football, the cricket, whatever it is. We are their window to the world from that perspective. So that's very important. So their budgets are very much allocated on a marketing perspective. And then I think they absolutely do the same thing that we would do as traditional brands. They look at what the revenue per user is in a different geography, and then they'll up their spend or down or not, right? And they'll go after it in an aggressive way. If they think, you know, you have to understand, like, I don't think that football, cricket, tennis, golf openly compete against each other. Like, there is this sort of undercurrent, like, you're not going to have an Open on the same weekend as an ATP event or a Wimbledon. Like, it just doesn't happen that way. But if you think about like first-person shooters, the publishers are kind of thinking, well, if I'm Ubisoft and I've got an FPS and Valve's got an FPS and someone else has got, like, they are kind of thinking about their audiences, right? Riot's got Valorant as well. So there's a little bit of a competitive angle there that they have to consider.
We talked about the connotations of brands and the reasons they may struggle within this space based on the stereotypes. One thing, particularly in this country, less so around other parts of the world, is the social associations and connotations of gaming, esports, on health. What do you think is the kind of correct way to address that? Because there is a huge amount that we've discussed that's incredibly positive: community, social side, engagement. How do you approach that side of the conversation?
It's something which is, I spend quite a lot of time with different government institutions and across the world, right? And we have this conversation a lot, which is, a minister will say, but I want to make sure that our youth is spending their time accurately and wisely. And so remember, there was this there's this world where people still believe that kids should be out kicking footballs, right? Or playing cricket. Our argument back is that you can create a safe environment for kids to be gaming as long as you put the guardrails in place, right? And you put control mechanisms around them. And you're very clear from the outset on a communication basis what is acceptable. And so we are very much trying to actively encourage that. We're also trying to work with institutions to encourage physical activity outside of gaming. We launched an initiative actually last year called Away from the Keyboard, AFK, and it was specifically geared to individuals showing that actually if you keep smart outside of your gaming environment, i.e. physically, it will have a very positive impact on you physically as well, mentally and your capability. So there's no secret here. If you look at all the professional esports clubs around the world, they've all got physical coaches, health coaches, nutritionists, dietists, all the rest of it, right? That is a major part of being a professional player in an esports environment. And our job is to encourage that.
Is there the opportunity to create more individualized content around these people, the celebritization of the gamers, the professional gamers competing within these teams to demonstrate that day in the life of follow nutrition pieces? It happens and is so popular in traditional sport. Yeah. And let's pick a rugby player out. You get people that love to see the amount of gym time they put in, how much fruit and yogurt they eat at breakfast, whatever it may be. Can we advertise that more from the gaming side?
We certainly could. And I think the challenge there is that if you take a 17-year-old gamer and you tell him we want to focus on the non-gaming element of your day-to-day, he's like, I don't want to do that, right? I want a game. And he knows that the sport component is hugely important. So he does the sport, or she does the sport component, the physical fitness moment. But there is not, at this moment in time, an enormous amount of content focused on that. We should definitely be doing that. If you've got, Simple is like this amazing Counter-Strike player. He's about 26. I don't know when a professional gamer retires. I get asked that as a question quite often, by the way, because
I was just about to say we haven't touched on the careers.
I think you might be past it, Charlie.
Yeah.
I'm definitely a long way gone. Right? I think you are between 28 and 30. At some point, your hand-eye coordination is not in the same place as you are when you're 18. And so I think that's the point in time. But again, I'm coming back to this guy, Simple, who plays for a Ukrainian team called Navi. He is phenomenal. I mean, he's global following, millions of eyeballs on his Insta, millions of eyeballs across all his socials. And he has a cult following from a fan perspective and can create an enormous amount of change, positive change. And that is something I think is very important for these superstars of tomorrow to start actually doing. They need to play the role that they actually have in this ecosystem, in this world.
We see it across traditional sport. We've had so many conversations in here, whether it's rugby or cricket or whatever it is, around building on the profiles of the assets these clubs or leagues or federations have. Interact with the individuals, because so much of the following now is on the athletes rather than the badge. People don't necessarily like to recognize it, but that's what it is. When I was out in India, it was, the kids sitting behind us in the cricket stadium, they were talking about football. And it was like, oh, we're Al Nassr fans. Now, they're not Al Nassr fans, right? They're Al Nassr fans because of Ronaldo. And I don't know if you think it happens in the same way within esports, but if you can actually leverage, as you said, that, if you can create this content around it and boost some of the social interactions, it can only be good for the whole ecosystem, because it shows a positive spin for the commercialization, for the media side, for the individual fan.
I mean, I think you're right. I think that it is fundamentally our responsibility to shine a light in a meaningful way on that part of the world, of the ecosystem we operate in. But let's be honest, when we create shoulder content for some of our shows, and we do a lot of this, it's a team out playing golf or having fun or whatever, we see a difference in terms of the viewership. If they're on the server playing the game, the viewership is colossal. And as soon as you switch to the desk, so if you think about our environment, our events, you're in the same way as you're watching football, right? So halftime happens, we go to Gary Lineker at halftime, wherever we go now, I don't even know. And
still him.
It's still there. Yeah. I've kind of lost track of that. And I guarantee you that we'll see a drop in viewership. So we go back to the desk off the back of a particular map, and you see a drop. You see, you look at your Twitch numbers or your own streaming channel, because we've got our own streaming channel, and it goes like this. Or when you go into a break or you're on shoulder content, the same thing happens. So the problem is the community only wants to game. And it's a fascinating challenge because you have a social responsibility to tell a story in a different light, and we have to do that. But at the same time, they know what they want.
They only want a game, but they also only want to interact with certain channels. You start sticking that out on TikTok and make it available for them in the platforms that they interact with already. Maybe it changes, maybe it doesn't. As you said, I don't know if it's an experimentation piece. I don't know whose responsibility it is. So it's an open discussion. I'm really interested in the media rights piece as a value add to the industry. I remember, that must have been 7 or 8 years ago, having one of the first conversations with someone from a publisher, and they sat there and they said, we will never put our fans behind a paywall. And I found that stuck with me because I love the sentiment of it, right? You want it accessible. At the same time, you're looking at the growth of the industry and you're thinking about how much money and revenue you can generate, and you look at other sports and entertainment products. The reality of the Premier League, for example, is its finances are driven by its media deal, and that is a huge part of its success.
Yeah.
If I said that to you now, we would never put our fans behind a paywall, and then the wider media landscape, media rights landscape for esports. What's your take on it?
It's challenging. It's challenging because if there was a world where a publisher was prepared to put its content behind a paywall, I actually think the ecosystem would be richer for the fans. I think that you would find that the amount of money that's flowing in that ecosystem and the ability for consumers to engage with it would be far richer. Their experience would be richer. It doesn't happen. So it's not currently behind a paywall. To be very clear, there is literally nothing that's behind a paywall in that way, right? And so when you look at the average revenue per head or monetization in esports versus the NFL, because I think you said the NFL before, I think we are $5 on 100 and they are at $5. Or they're at 500, whatever of them. It is honestly 100 to 1 perhaps. And so I think that is something that we have to focus on. But why has that happened? You have streaming platforms that give content away for free. And I think that when you are only dependent on an ad-funded model, I think, and you come back to our first conversation about brands wanting to engage with that sort of content, you're going to be challenged on monetization. What we found that's interesting is that in certain pockets of the world, certain rights are very valuable, and therefore local language rights have become something which we trade. So you take our ecosystem around something called Blast Premier, which is Counter-Strike. It's in 32 languages, it's in 200 million homes, it's in 150 countries. So we do distribution deals with all of those destinations. And some of the buyers are paying a lot of money for those rights because they know they can monetize them through advertisers and through sponsors. We then have our own streaming platform called Blast.tv. None of that is behind a paywall, just to be clear. And would we ever be in a position where we could make that switch? It's difficult.
Does it scare you? An ad model, well, an ad-funded part of a company that's so influential to your business?
I think that if you're going to get ad-funded is one thing. I have no problem with an ad-funded model. I think that if you offer content, and I think consumers are probably prepared to accept the ads. I think they will only pay for subscription if the consumer experience on the platform, i.e. the functionality, the technology that sits behind it, is so different to what the lowest common denominator elsewhere is, then they'll pay for it. Because don't forget, these consumers are driven by technology first. They love it. They know what they want. They know what they don't want. They'll throw it out with the bathwater straight away. You know, we went live with Blast TV and we weren't in 4K. And then we want 4K. And then when we put 4K on, they love it, and we don't turn 4K on because if you've got bandwidth, whatever, you know, then they're like, why haven't we got 4K? But they want it for free, you know. So I think if you offer something which is different, i.e. if you offered a streaming service where consumers had the ability to interact with the players, with the casters, they could influence the show. By the way, that's absolutely what we're trying to do. And they have a meaningful relationship with the content, then I think you win.
Do you think it's a cultural thing? And what I mean by that is, I'm not saying and not suggesting that I think esports competitive gaming will ever be on like a linear TV Sky subscription model, because we as a generation are used to paying that kind of thing. I'll speak for myself, I don't know about you. I will keep paying for my Sky Sports and my TNT Sports because I'm just not going to sacrifice that
Yeah.
side of it. I will do it. But the generation coming up now, because of the free content that's been accessible, won't accept that model. They'll find other ways to watch it. However, if you start integrating it like we've seen on a Netflix model, where they're starting to bring in live sport, which the younger audiences and the new generations are already used to maybe paying for, willing to accept that subscription fee because it has other content on it. Do you think if Netflix, Disney, Paramount Plus started bidding and getting involved in rights for esports content, it would? But do you think that that would kind of fall somewhere in the middle of acceptable to the audience and also really profitable and desirable for you as an industry business?
I think that would be a game changer. I think, and I know there's talk of this, right? I think it would be. I mean, interestingly, we've actually done some stuff with Disney's carrier in India. I think it's called
Star Plus.
Star Plus. We actually were on there, right? I mean, it was a smaller carriage deal, but the start of, right? I think that if they did engage that and started bundling our gaming rights as part of that, and we got a part of that pie, that would be interesting. I actually think there might be another model, which is the Now TV model. If you take the Now TV model here in the UK, let's say that on a weekend we offered something that no one else could get. Would they be prepared to pay $10 for that particular, same way we pay for the boxing or we pay as a one-off for the football? If you had an esports event that you've never been able to pay for, you wouldn't get it unless you pay $10 for it. I think that might start a consumer trend which values esports in a way that's not today. That might be interesting as a stopgap. Because do I think that League of Legends are going to put everything behind a paywall and charge their consumers $5 a month? Probably not. Why? Because they make way more money on their in-game transactions and they don't want to alienate their users as a consequence of that. If that then became such a meaningful amount, it might change.
One of the most interesting parts of your business in particular, but the wider industry that you've touched on already, is the publisher's relationship with third-party content and providers. And distributors. I think from my perspective, you look at that and you go, that's really scary because you're building business models on the assumption that that publisher continues to want to lease the rights for its titles. And you're building a business, let's say Blast Premier, as you said, with Counter-Strike, that relies on access to those rights. Is that a concern when building a company, that you lose the access to the core product and therefore your main revenue stream within this space as a third-party provider disappears?
So it's great because you've got your investor hat on here, right?
Yeah, that's where we're going. Yeah.
It is a question we get asked a lot, right? So you're actually only as good as your relationships and your licenses that sit behind them. But I would suggest that your moat is created also by the community that sits there and watches it. The interesting thing here is if the broadcaster, because I put ourselves in that shoe, or the operator does a really bad job on a given title, the community are up in arms. But the publishers are watching every step of the way. They know where quality lies and where they know where it doesn't lie. But fundamentally, we're only as good as the licenses that we have with the publishers. We are dependent on those publishers to work with us on a integrated basis. And that's why as a business, we've started trying to be far more of a provider to publishers with various different services and not just, hey, we're putting on a show in Sao Paulo. It's much more integrated than that. And so there becomes this symbiotic relationship where you are reliant on each other to the best possible extent.
Absence of specifics, what do those agreements look like? Are they long-term agreements? Are they things that have break clauses in if a very poor job is done? I'm interested in the kind of security you can get from that to then actually commit what you need to make it really successful.
These are multi-year relationships. They are exclusive. They're exclusive licenses to an operator like Blast. There are others, right, by the way. And they do have clauses in there where if we are not performing or the game isn't performing, there are outs that are available. But they're robust. And the other thing that's important about the way that this industry has changed in the last 5 years is that publishers have now started working hand in hand with the operators to create models where it's win-win. And so on a day-to-day basis, we're very integrated in discussions that are going on at a publisher level. We've got our teams in there, they're with us. There's a proper working relationship and so forth. This is not a, hey, here Blast, operate this thing on our behalf. It is much more integrated. That's an evolution since the last sort of 2 or 3 years.
It brings it back to the definition, I think, between esports and gaming. If we're looking at how the publishers value each and how that kind of sits within their ecosystem. If you're looking at esports, I think, give or take, don't quote me on the numbers, let's say the revenues are low single-digit billions, 2 to 3 billion a year. Look at gaming, it's up to about 200 billion now, so far ahead of movies and music and the things that you would say it competes with in an entertainment cycle. With that in mind, we're talking about esports being the competitive end and the bit you go to the stadium with, and gaming being the bit you do at home with your mates. How do you think publishers view esports to them? Where's its value? Is it the marketing arm of the game and a great chance to push it out there to then go and sell games back into the wider gaming audience, or is it something different?
It's definitely that, right? It's definitely a marketing arm of, ultimately, in the same way that we've spent our lives watching football and cricket and we aspire to, you talked about the Al Nassr example there, right? There is a relationship with Al Nassr now because of Ronaldo. You have a relationship with the game because of a given player, because of a given team in esports. And so it's in the publisher's absolute mindset to try and create that, because when you and I are in a stadium or watching online, we just want to play like that individual. And so therefore, the competitive element of esports is hugely important to them. And that is why they're prepared to put money behind the marketing side of it, spend money on stadium events, spend money on having studios that operate all year round. Take the studio of Riot in Europe, and they've got one in America as well. I mean, they've got their League of Legends stuff going on, they've got their Valorant stuff going on. That studio is going all the time. And it's important. So I do think it is a marketing play. I think that that fundamentally, though, I do think these publishers want an association with their game to be driven by passion. I mean, Fortnite is unbelievably exciting as a brand, right? The passion that's associated with Fortnite on a pure basis by fans is enormous, and the player base is enormous. Anyone who's doing a licensing deal with Fortnite is getting an enormous amount of value off the back of that as well. And there are many, many brands that do that around the world. And then you think about the deals they've done more recently with Lego and Disney. I mean, why wouldn't they? I mean, is there going to be like a Disney World in Fortnite? That could be incredible, right? So I love this sort of coming together of brands and games and creating an environment where there's a synergy together. I think that's hugely fascinating. And I used to live through some of that at Disney when I was working at Disney, and I was always very impressed by, how many brands wanted to associate with Disney. And I think it's the same for some of these global gaming publishers too.
What about the investment side? So we're looking at an industry which, let's use some of the crass terminology that gets thrown around, booms very quickly, creates the potential bubble effect, huge amount of attention and eyeballs and apparent spend money, revenue, etc. That attracts a lot of interest from funds, individuals, sovereigns, you name it, and puts a lot of pressure on an industry to then return on that expectation. Can you give, from maybe a few years back as well, can you give a little insight into what that investment landscape has looked like within esports and where it's kind of at now?
Yeah, so I think if you take a bit of a history in esports investment, there was an environment sort of pre my time actually as well, but where a lot of money came into the space. A lot of American money came into buying slots within franchised ecosystems, Overwatch and Call of Duty and League of Legends. A lot of American family money, high net worth, those who are associated with sort of traditional sport for that matter, put a play on esports. I think that whilst esports didn't skip a beat during the pandemic, i.e. it was the only thing that was on blooming available, monetization really did. It suffered from a monetization standpoint. I mean, fundamentally, brands started spending less money during the pandemic from that perspective, and then the rights obviously went down as a consequence. So I think that esports benefited from a viewership benefit in the pandemic, but not on a monetization basis. So those original investors that came in 16, 17, 18, didn't see a return in the cycle that they wanted, that they would traditionally want from an investment. And that created this notion of what we've called in our industry a cold winter. And the esports industry had a bit of a cold time. And there was a couple of brands that had gone public. And then when they IPO'd, they suffered as a consequence. And so there was a downturn in the esports market. I actually think that's now coming back up again. I think this is very similar to many sectors. I think there are some investments that investors make in the industry at the beginning, which are opportunistic. The industry's in a boom moment and there's a lot of money thrown at it. And then it levels out and it matures. And I think we're in that period where it's leveled out. I think those businesses that have not performed, or business models that just don't work within the industry are now gone.
So we kind of stopped seeing the 40, 50 million spend on a franchise slot to create a little bit more sustainability.
It's no longer there. Because the teams during that period of time were not able to monetize in the way that you expected, in the same way that an NFL team is a multi-billion-dollar asset, right? Unfortunately, an esports team at this moment in time is not a multi-billion-dollar asset because of the conversation we had earlier on around the media rights side of things. They are not making the same amount of money from the league that they would like to make from a media rights angle than the same as the NFL is. And that's interesting.
Do you see it as collective value? And what I mean by that is, we're all actually in this together, the companies within that ecosystem. We all need to show how valuable this industry actually is as we're still growing, to make sure that we keep this interest, this appetite from investors, from external money coming in to give us the opportunity to reach our full potential.
100%. It is not in my interest as CEO of Blast or the industry overall to see the industry suffer, and therefore it needs to have a common goal which is associated with growth. We all need to make sure the mainstream brands are coming into the space. We all need to push our media rights value to a place where it becomes very valuable for everyone. We need to have better access to data and to consumers. We need to be able to market intelligently. We need to be able to protect our consumers. So there's 5 examples there, but we have a common goal together to drive this industry forward.
Is there enough collaboration between traditional entertainment properties and this new converging world of gaming, esports, digital, let's call it, or whatever we crassly again want to reference it as? What I mean by that is traditional sport, movie studios, music massively benefit from what gaming and esports can tap into. Are we seeing enough collaboration and crossover between the two? You mentioned the Fortnite capabilities, but from an audience perspective, from a commercial perspective, from an investment perspective, is there more we can do to create that collective entertainment ecosystem now? If
you take traditional entertainment players within the sort of B2B space, I think they are very engaged. So if you take your IMG Endeavors and your others of this world, Live Nations, etc., they have all understood that esports is going to be powerful and important for them, so they're engaging. Are the movie studios phoning up the publishers? Probably yes, that is happening, and they want to do collaborations with the publishers. We just don't see it as much from our angle, right? I think we'd like to see more of that. I mean, so there's an age-old challenge, which is if you put on an event in Sao Paulo or anywhere in the world, could you get Live Nation to bring in, or could you get a Warner Music or a movie studio, a record studio to be able to provide the artists to come in? And does the fans actually want that? So it goes back to our other conversation around, do they want Drake to who do they want? So the Superbowl is a brilliant example of everything that I think that esports should probably aspire to. Because you have an environment where you've got this incredible marketing opportunity, incredible media rights opportunity. You end up at the halftime show, which is done by Drake or by Rihanna, whoever it is. The tickets go for gold dust. The whole thing is like the pinnacle of the pinnacle. And I think that if esports can get there, then we are in dreamland, I think, actually. When I walk into venues, I'm like, I want this to be the Superbowl. But honestly, Charlie, I think we're a long way away from that. Like, I'm kidding myself if we're saying that the Ibirapuera Stadium in Sao Paulo is the same, right?
You've got it, again, maybe specifically for Blast, reference Blast Premier, but you've got like a Formula One type series. And what I mean by that is you take this on the road into different cultures and activate fan bases in loads of different ways. But one thing that is incredible, having been to some of the events, is the fandom and the level of interaction. How come you haven't done a Drive to Survive type series with one of these streaming companies attached to Blast coming and following you around for a season and seeing what it is
Watch
really
this
like?
space. There's something in progress, actually.
So you see it as a massively valuable opportunity to basically help develop the proposition.
I think if we can tell the story through the lens of the consumer and we can get behind the scenes in some capacity. We've done a little bit of it. We did it at the Major last year in Paris. We shot some content ourselves and put it out on our own environment. Did very well, but I think it needs a Prime or it needs a Netflix or someone to license it. I think that will happen. We're not far. I think that's exciting. I think that tells a good story. I suppose I'm just sort of saying I think the industry needs more. It just needs more pizzazz and just needs. I think we had a period in the last 3 years where things were a little bit cold. And now things are changing and moving in that direction.
And you feel that? You feel positive then about the sustainability of the industry?
Look, I can only reflect on the results that we're facing as a business, and we're doing really well. The company's grown massively in the last 3-4 years. If I look at where we've come from as a base level versus what we've got now currently in terms of our operations, our contracts, our business with different publishers around the world, kudos to the team. Like, they've just knocked it out of the park. And so, but I think more than it being Blast, it's about the industry growing and the industry saying, okay, well, we're going to invest more behind some of these titles. Now, the business economics, the business models have changed, and that's okay. And we've adapted with the time. Look, I also think that we shouldn't negate the fact that, the Saudis have put a lot of money in esports. And I think that's okay. I think the fact is that Saudi have decided that they want a strategy where they want to focus eyeballs on gaming and esports. And if that is rising the tide for everyone, I think that's really helpful.
We've seen so much of it in traditional sport, obviously. And it's something that comes up again of where you take your financing from versus what the actual long-term strategy of those people are. When you look for investment, what's the key? What do you really focus on from the investors that really want to have a future within Blast?
Long-term goal. This is not a business that if you're thinking I'm going to go in and get a return in 2 years' time that's meaningful, that is not this industry. This industry needs time to further mature, to develop. It will run another couple of cycles before it gets to a point where the valuations get to a place where they're really interesting. Yeah. So you need to be prepared to wait. And therefore, there are different types of investors that are in that structure. So I think you've got more strategic ones that are beneficial to the industry, where there's clearly ties with it. I think you've got individuals who have passion points that are associated with it. Do I think that pure financial investors are going to come in massively in esports at the moment? Probably not.
Should we do a quick fire?
Yeah.
What do you think is the most untapped region for you as Blast within the esports environment?
South America.
Is that because of the fandom that you've seen at the event recently?
It's if you take from my wife's Colombia. No, that's not the reason. It's from the north to the south. Like, the passion and the fandom associated with multiple games within South America is phenomenal, but the monetization is just not as strong. Like, the amount of spending power those individuals have is far less. So that's one area where I'd say it's very interesting.
What's your favourite game to watch?
I love Counter-Strike. That is the thing I watch when I just find it absolutely fascinating. The passion, the pure raw talent, the skill, I just find it incredible.
Chief executive of a major organisation in this space. Comes with its pressures as well as the positives. What keeps you up at night?
I have 3 kids.
What keeps you up at night concerning company related work?
People and financial performance. I am very focused on making sure that we've got the right people in the right jobs and that they are okay. Important for me, number one. Number two is driving result for our investors and making sure that we keep that trajectory. We've got a very good trajectory. I want to keep that going. And I just really get frustrated when people spend money badly. That really annoys me.
We've talked a lot about crossover of industries. What's the best example of kind of crossover with gaming in a traditional entity that you can think of?
Look, I mean, I think some of the work that that Lego have done, that Disney will do with Fortnite, I think that's fascinating. I think you'll find that, even Drake wearing a FaZe Clan memorabilia was very, very important. I think there is an enormous amount of opportunity there for the future, for future collaboration. For me, that is massively important.
Finally, if you could send out one message to improve the thinking around the industry and educating people who may not know a huge amount about it around esports, what would that be? Why should they come to a Blast event? Why should they interact with this space?
Come and watch what happens on the server. So physically watch it, and also come to a venue and feel that raw passion. I think that you cannot replicate that passion in any other walk of life. We just don't see it. It's sports and esports. And that's why they are so close, because the same feeling of absolute joy and enthusiasm and our brain just going into overdrive when someone scores a goal from favorite team happens when Simple does a kill that is just insane, or a quad kill, like whatever it is. That is something you can't replicate elsewhere. And I think that is very powerful.
It's a perfect place to end. Robbie, I've loved it.
Thank you
so much for joining.
It's an absolute pleasure.